All right, today we have a 2011 Impala. You can see 3.5 liter. And we're gonna be doing the head gasket. First things first, we're gonna take off this plastic cover here, moving the oil fill and the two support mounts. Next we have the motor mounts, held on by a 13, these two 15s, and one 15 bolt. With those out of the way, next we're gonna work on the air box. Got the mass airflow sensor, breather tube, and a clamp. It should come right out. Now we're gonna do the reservoir so that we can get to the serpentine belt. Two little 10s and a small hose on the bottom of it, about there. With the reservoir removed, we can get to the tensioner. 3/8 ratchet right in that little square right there. We're gonna pull it to the right and remove tension on the belt. We can pull the belt off. If you're having trouble removing the belt, some models have a small bracket right here for the power steering line. Point to it now. Touching it with the standard. If you do, you need an 8mm to get that bolt out, and you can get the belt off. With the serpentine belt removed, we're gonna start working on the wire harness. So disconnect the battery so we can take the main positive off the alternator. It's a 13 nut and the clip. With the alternator disconnected, we can start working on the other sensors around the top of the engine to move the wire harness. If you're having trouble reaching, you can pull the car forward and the engine will rock, as you can see, and then apply the e-brake and you'll be able to reach the back easier. With the wire harness out of the way, we can remove the fuel line, the two PCV hoses, and then we can get to the spark plug wires. With the spark plug wires and the various air hoses out of the way and the fuel line, you can start removing the rest of the coil pack and remove the wires in the back. Then the power steering pump, there's some 13s, you go through the pulley. We can get this loose so we can start working on the alternator. Okay, the coil pack's a little hard to see, but there's two 13mm bolts right here. And then right here, two 13mm nuts on some studs in the back. With the coil pack out of the way and the power steering pump loose, you can start taking off the alternator. There's a 15 right here. Now there's two studs in the back. Let me get the light. Right above the power steering line, there's one, and just to the left of that is another. The other opposite end of this front bolt goes into these bracket on top of the intake. Okay. There's a bolt, and here's the stud bolt. You don't have to remove it, but it's easier if you do. Now we can finally start working on the upper intake. See all these bolts with the divot in it on top, but also the bracket for the coolant lines you'll have to remove. That'll be holding it down. Okay, next we have the idler pulley bracket, so we can get to the alternator bracket. Start working on the lower intake. There are three 15mm bolts, one directly under the pulley, and those two lower ones, black, going into the black bracket. Next we're going to remove the coolant lines, so it's time to drain the coolant. Spigot at the bottom, and you're going to want to remove the oil dipstick, and then this hose clamp right here, and this 10mm bolt. This will be tight. Be careful pulling that out, you don't want to damage it. We're going to lay all the coolant lines over to the side so we can start taking these brackets off. Okay, with those two coolant lines in the front out of the way, we're going to remove these two hoses and power steering pump, move it upward so we can start moving the main water outlet right here. It's going to be one large 15 in the back, and we're going to have three 15 bolts. You can see two of them right there, you see them, and one more pretty much right to the right of that lower one, and we pull that water outlet out. Okay, so next we'll need the motor mount brackets. This one, pretty easy, just the three 15s, you'll see them. This one is under the exhaust. We got the top one there. Then there's two horizontal. You can see one of them right there above the AC compressor. And then that lower AC compressor bolt also goes into that bracket. You don't need to remove the AC, but once you remove all those bolts, you can kind of wiggle this out. With those brackets gone, we can start taking off the valve covers and start getting to the lower intake. The valve covers are these 8mm bolts right here. We also can start taking off the shroud for the connecting pipe of the exhaust. Some pins on there, and then the exhaust will be 13, so I'll show you in a minute. Okay, next we have the lower intake. Just gonna move these gaskets. You usually need to replace these. Then we have these 10mm bolts holding it on, and on either side, get the light here, there's 2 more 10mm bolts. So they're a little dirty, but here's one here and one under this wire right here. It's the same on the other side, and then we can pull that right up. There's also 2 clips you want to do. The coolant temp sensor there and right there. Remove those and we'll be able to pull the lower intake right up. Okay, with the lower intake off, it's time to remove the rocker arms. These are all the same, so don't worry about it, but they are 8s, and you want to be careful taking them off. You don't want to break a bolt in there. Then we can remove the push rods. I'll show you those in a minute, and we can get that gasket out of the way and start doing the exhaust before the head bolts. Okay, with the rocker arms out, we can start removing the push rods. Now, these are not the same. You can see one is shorter, so that coincides with the position of the valves. You see this one is closer to the inside of the engine, this one's closer to the outside. The one on the outside is an exhaust valve, and it is the longer one. Intake, shorter. Just remember that. Okay, with the rockers and push rods gone, we can remove these gaskets. You're always gonna wanna replace these. Just get the set if you're ever gonna do this. They just pop right off. Real easy when you put it back together. And then when you start removing the exhaust. So this has 3 13mm nuts on here on both sides. Remove all 6 of those. And then the rear exhaust you will have to remove before you remove the head. So there's 2 bolts per pipe. So all 6 of those you'll have to do on the back side. I do recommend using like PB Blaster or something like that to loosen it up, WD-40, just because it's exhaust. So they're gonna rust in there, they're gonna be very tight. Just let it sit for like 5-10 minutes before you try loosening the bolts. But the front, you don't have to take off. I'm just showing you so you can see the orientation of the bolts. One on top, one below. So 6 bolts total, 2 per tube. Give you a little view of the back here. It's gonna be difficult. You will have to remove that shroud, just same as the front. There's some 10mm bolts holding it on, and use an extension and a deep 13 to get to the exhaust bolts. And then the exhaust will just sit there, but the front exhaust will come up with the head. Okay, with the exhaust removed, we can start getting to the head bolts. Got 8 of these large 15s right here. Always remember to do outside first, then work your way in, and we can pull the head up. Okay, with the heads off, it's time to get rid of these old gaskets. Clean up the block. We'll send those heads out to the machine shop. Make sure to clean up everything. We're gonna remove these old little silicone gaskets here. Get new ones in the set. Put everything in. We'll start putting it back together. Okay, we got the head gasket set. Heads back from the machine shop. This one just happened to come with a blue and a black, but they're both Felpro. It's the only brand we trust. And now it's time to put the heads in. Rear one first is much easier. Now it's time to torque the head down. Got all the bolts started and greased up. So you're gonna do this X pattern starting here, go to that back one, and this one, then this back one, then here, and here, and here, and there. It's gonna be 44 foot-pounds to start. Do all the bolts in that sequence, and then 95-degree turn. So you can put a little white out on the bolt so you can see the position of it, but do the 44 pounds first, then the 95, all 8. Okay, with the head torqued, it's time to do the exhaust. Be sure to change out the gasket. It's just those 6 bolts. Okay, after the exhaust, it's time to put on the front head or left hand, and we're gonna repeat the same pattern. Okay, we're gonna torque it down again. Be sure to change the exhaust gasket, and you can put the exhaust back on since you get it back from the machine shop now. Remember, 44 pounds. I'm gonna start with this X pattern here, 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 and here. 44 pounds, and then 95 degrees. You can mark the bolt with some white out if you like. All right, now that the heads are torqued, it's time for these little guys. There's 2 of them in the kit. They go on the sides right here. There we go. Also, the kit's gonna come with some silicone, and we're gonna apply that a generous amount here and here for the lower intake gaskets. So it holds them in place and it creates a seal right there. See, we got a little bit of silicone there. It's time for the push rod guides, or the lower intake gaskets. These are gonna fit right in here. There's little divots on the back of it, so they kind of sit in the head. But as you can see, it squishes down the silicone. We're gonna do both sides. And then we are going to apply a little bit more silicone. Then it'll be time for the push rods. Okay, now we're gonna put the push rods in. Remember, some are shorter. Those are the intake ones, and some are longer. Those are the exhaust. So we can see this one farther back, so it's exhaust. This one's closer, that's intake. And we're gonna feed it into this gasket. Closer, closer, farther, closer, and farther. Next we can put the rockers on. Now it's time for the rockers. See this little groove on the bottom there? That is going to fit in that little slot, like so. We're gonna line it up like that. And you definitely wanna start these all by hand first. Last thing you want is to strip these out after you got the heads back and all cleaned up. So just get them all started, move on to each one, get everyone started, and then they're self-adjusting. So you just tighten it down until it stops. I recommend doing it by hand so you don't break anything. And then repeat the process on the front head. All right, so we have these all in place and they're hand tight, definitely not snug as you can see. And that's because you're gonna wanna make sure it's in the right position, directly on top of the valve. And some of these are gonna move as you tighten them. Some of the valves are gonna be open normally, but you see that valve going down? That's normal, because the cam is in a certain position right now. But you wanna make sure it's on top of the valve and tighten it till it bottoms out. You repeat the process for all of them. Not everyone's gonna compress, but some are. Just make sure it's sitting on top of the valve. Okay, the rear is all done. Just to reiterate, for the front, make sure it's sitting right in the middle on top of the valve, not off to the side. It'll tighten down like that, but it might not always fall into place. Then you have to do this all again. All right, with the rockers and push rods done, as you can see the lower intake, a little hard to hold the camera and put this down at the same time. So just go straight down with it. Try not to push in either direction. Make sure no sensors get caught. And just lay it down gently. That's why we got all that silicone there. We don't want to mess that up. And then we're gonna put all the 10s in and tighten it up. Don't forget the top exhaust shroud in the back. And then we're gonna move on to the valve covers. Remember, it's just the 4/8. Clean up the surface and replace the gaskets and pop those on. Okay, with the valve covers on, now it's time to put these brackets back on. You just fit it in there, slide it around, and put the bolts. I'm gonna put the phone down, put it in. Okay, next is the water outlet, which if you'll remember is also the mount for the alternator. You're gonna wanna replace those 2 gaskets here and here. It's easier if you just put the bolts through the water outlet and then stick the gasket on that. You could silicone if you want, but you can do these 3 bolts and we will get to the other 3 later. All right, with the water outlet back on, we can put the large hoses on. We can replace the large exhaust pipe there and put both shrouds on, and then put the power steering pump back in place. If you removed the pulleys to get extra room, not that you had to, put those back on before you do the power steering pump. The ribbed one goes in the front there, This large smooth one with this washer in the front goes down in the lower part right here, and the thinner smooth one goes on the top. Okay, with all the pulleys on, now you can put the alternator back in, and then we will get the coil back and hook that up. Do not do the final bolt for the alternator yet. You can fit it through the hole, but remember, we're gonna have to use the nut as part of the upper intake. Okay, with the exhaust all done, those brackets, we can put these hoses back around the edge. Over, get the mount here. We'll connect the hose back on, and on this part, you're gonna wanna replace that O-ring, and maybe throw a little silicone on if you want, but be careful putting it in. You don't wanna shear it off. It's a very common spot these leak. All right, now it's time for the upper intake. Be sure to replace these gaskets as well, and leave that nut off. It's gonna go on there. Just gonna lay it straight down, and then we can do the alternator right after, and we'll start hooking up all the lines. Okay, with the upper intake on, we can put the coil pack back on and start hooking up the air hoses and the fuel line. Get those wires back draped over, the vacuum tube, and then we will start working on the air box and the belt. Okay, with the spark plug wires back on and the air hoses and the vacuum line and the fuel line, it's time to start doing the wires and the serpentine belt. And I guess we could throw the air box in too. Okay, with the wires and the serpentine belt on, we got our oil and coolant in there. Don't forget to get the dipstick back in. You might have to pull this spark plug wire out. And last but not least is the motor mounts, and we can start it. Would be the support mounts and the reservoir. Don't forget the little hose, and you'll be good to go. Okay, with the reservoir in, everything's connected. All right, go ahead. And there you go. That's how to change the head gasket on the Chevy 3.5.